Welcome. My name is Lauren Avellone, and I am a research associate with the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center at Virginia Commonwealth University. I'll be presenting today with my colleague, Josh Taylor. Josh, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah, I'm Josh Taylor. I'm also a research associate here at the VCU RRTC. So really excited to present on one of our favorite topics today.
This webinar is a part of a series of informational tools that was developed under a grant by NIDLR, which is the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. So today we'll be discussing the topic of employment and post-secondary education programs for individuals with intellectual disabilities.
So when we start with this topic, I think it's important, unfortunately, to start with some of the bad news. And that is really that the unemployment for individuals with intellectual disabilities, despite a lot of efforts within the research, changes in the policy, and really an emphasis in practice for several decades, is still unemployment is still very, very high. So we have only about 34% of all individuals with intellectual disabilities that are what we consider working age are actually working. And even a smaller percentage of that are in what we consider a competitive integrated jobs, only about 18% of those. So really before we get into talking about post-secondary education programs and some of these initiatives, I think we need to just show the overall context of this is really an area of dire need for folks with intellectual disabilities overall.
Higher education is a known pathway to employment for individuals without disabilities. So individuals with any level of college are more likely to become employed and also make higher wages. So as a result of those strikingly low employment rates for individuals with intellectual disabilities that Josh just referred to, federal efforts were made to create opportunities to extend those recognized benefits of post-secondary education to students with intellectual disabilities. So one of the ways in which federal efforts achieved this was through HEOA, which is the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008. Students with intellectual disabilities had attended different types of college programs prior to HEOA, but often experienced a lot of barriers. And usually that was related to funding or being able to get finances in order to attend those programs. So HEOA really removed those funding barriers and also increased the number of post-secondary education programs across the United States. And one of the ways in which they did that was through TPSIDs. Those are known as transition and post-secondary programs for students with ID. And there's different kinds of TPSID programs. Those are inclusive, separate, and mixed hybrid. And that really refers to the level of inclusiveness that those students with intellectual disabilities experience in the program. So an inclusive program would mean that students with intellectual disabilities are really immersed with other students without disabilities in the college setting. Separate is usually referring to more substantially separate programs. So students with intellectual disabilities are on a college campus, but most of their coursework and other activities are not necessarily as integrated with students who do not have intellectual disabilities. And then of course, the mixed hybrid version has a little of each. And then finally, the TPSID programs were really focusing on, instead of just a traditional college trajectory, also incorporating specialized courses that look at academic, social, independent living, and employment skill training. So not all PSC programs are TPSIDs. So combined TPSIDs and non-TPSID programs for students with ID, there's over 295 nationwide currently. The focus of this webinar today is really on the impact of these PSC programs. So those are both TPSID and the non-TPSID programs on employment outcomes. So several general reviews have been done in the literature between 2001 and 2013. And overall, consistency with the findings really indicated that there was a lack of certain areas that were emphasized within the literature. Those being focus on employment outcomes specifically. There was also a lack of stringent research design often observed among studies. So when we talk about research design, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, we're really looking at levels of research rigor. So at the highest level of rigor, you have randomized control studies, followed by more quasi-experimental or correlational. We really weren't seeing within the literature that there were any sort of really high level, methodologically stringent research surrounding PSE programs that were specific to employment. There was also a noted consistency in key terminology. So key terminology refers to a lot of different things, but in particular, that level of inclusiveness that we just mentioned. There was pretty much wide variation in how the level of inclusive, if it wasn't fully inclusive, was it partially inclusive or mostly inclusive? And then also with the hybrid and mix, to what extent? And then finally, there wasn't a lot of information on transition processes from post-secondary education to employment. It's one of the major objectives in this particular webinar is to look at those employment outcomes. And so that literature between 2001 and 2013 really readily acknowledged that there hadn't been much published related specifically to employment up until that point. So that sort of sets the table for the purpose of our current review. So HEOA, again, was passed in 2008, so it's been over a decade since then. And so that sort of begs the question of where we are in terms of understanding how impactful post-secondary education programs are for students with intellectual disabilities in terms of promoting employment outcomes. So we wanted to really look at the 21st century. So we looked at literature from 2000 until today, most current, 2020. So that gives us good 2 decades of literature for us to review. And we looked at 2 different types of literature, which Josh will talk a little bit more about in a moment, but we looked at gray literature and also peer-reviewed literature. We also wanted to pick up on some of the gaps that had been noted by those previous researchers. So in particular, we wanted to focus exclusively and expansively on employment, but we also wanted to look at the experiences related to employment that students were getting both during and after their enrollment in the PSE program. And then certainly account for those other factors, like has there been any stringent research methodology used in the time frame that wasn't captured in 2001 to 2013? Was there any increase in consistency in terms of the level of inclusiveness? Has any increase in reporting on connection to adult services, any follow-along support, or other types of services that would ensure job retention following a student's exit from a PSE program? So the information that was collected was, again, gained from sources that were either peer-reviewed literature or gray literature, and we organized those findings into a scoping review, which is sort of a broad method for mapping the existing literature on a particular topic area. First, on this slide, before we get into our findings from that scoping review, I'll just go over the basic overview of how we organize that literature to kind of give you an idea of the guiding research questions we had, and then how we organized the results. So as you can see on this slide, this is our organizational method. There is a table that has 6 boxes, and moving from left to right, it's describing the citation that we used. So we would put in which journal article we found that met set criteria related to employment and post-secondary education programs for students with ID. And then we would write down the method or population, which is in the next box. And then also next to that would be the program and type of credential. So the program is looking at that level of inclusiveness, whether it was substantially separate, inclusive, or a mixed hybrid program. And the credential is really looking at what did they earn while they were in that actual PSE program. So PSE programs run at 2- and 4-year universities. You can take courses for audit, for credit, or for certificate of completion. So we really wanted to document what types of credentials students were earning while they were in the program. And then again, how long the program was. Was it a 2-year or 4-year program? Next, we looked at employment-focused components during the program. So this really gets into, while they were enrolled, what were they actually getting in terms of applied experience or employment coursework. So the employment coursework could be anything that ranges from a course that is in their area of interest, so something that they would major in, or it could be something that's more general, like a career exploration course that sort of teaches them how to gain basic career skills and consider different types of career opportunities that might be a good match for them. And then the actual applied experiences range as well. So those are typically either internships or paid work or job shadowing experiences, something that would give them actual applied experience. So again, that is during enrollment in the program. So then we also wanted to look at after they leave the program. So whether they graduate, they complete the criteria, once they've actually left, what sort of employment outcomes are they having? Are they leaving with paid work? Are they getting paid work in the community after they've exited? And then lastly, it's that transition process. So what does the PSE program provide in terms of transitioning the student to the community employment? And again, that gets into, are they providing follow-along supports, or are they providing any sort of connection to adult services, just to kind of promote job retention and make sure that after they leave the program that there is any support provided. And we wanted to know these things just to sort of analyze whether or not there were consistencies among programs related to positive employment outcomes that could help us understand if particular processes or experiences during the program were in any way related to later achieving employment, which would again give us a better idea of really what's effective in PSE programs in helping students ultimately get jobs.
So let's talk a little bit about what we actually did as part of our team to conduct the scoping review and sort of how that process led us to the results that we're going to talk about a little bit today. So as Lauren touched on, a scoping review is similar if you've heard of a systematic literature review, but it's going to go a little bit more broadly to include not just research and evidence from the peer-reviewed research literature, but also some of what we call those gray literature sources. And so those gray literature sources are going to be things that don't necessarily appear in journal articles or in that peer review literature, but maybe government reports, maybe analyses that are not published in a traditional way, but maybe provided through specific advocacy organizations. It could be through organizations that organize programs like these post-secondary education programs. So we also want to look at those because the purpose is going to go a little bit broader than a typical systematic review to actually kind of scope out, you know, what is the extent to which we have an understanding of this within the field. So we want to be very, very broad in this, but we also want to be very systematic. So like a systematic literature review, in this scoping review, we looked at multiple sources that kind of overlapped in terms of the reach of finding articles and finding other sources that were included that we could say we exhaustively found evidence supporting PSE as a means of employment. So if you look at the flow chart here on the right side of the slide, you can see a series of boxes with arrows pointing to the next one. And this represents sort of our review process for first collecting records, and the majority of which were articles and peer-reviewed manuscripts, and then processing and screening and analyzing those records until we have a final sample that's included as the body of evidence for our review. And so as you can see, we had almost 6,000 records that were identified through that systematic process that included both peer-reviewed and gray literature sources. But because we're looking at different databases that overlap considerably, almost 2,500 of those were duplicates. And so those were removed initially before we started reviewing those. But that also did include um, almost 3,000 records that were unique. So of those, 3,500 were screened for what we call title and abstract. And basically what that means is we're going to make a brief scan of just making sure that the topic is somewhat related to what we're looking at, right? And so because of we want to be as exhaustive as possible within this process initially to make sure we don't miss anything. There are a lot of things that aren't related at all, and so we can quickly exclude those. So that got us down to 62 articles that were somewhat related to the topic and the research questions that we laid out for the scoping review. So those 62 articles we then read in their entirety with the team, and it included a total of 12 that met criteria, that had the information we're looking for, that presented evidence related specifically to the research questions that Lauren has described. And so of those, 11 of those were peer-reviewed studies, and one was a gray literature source. So from almost 6,000 down to 12 to find exactly what we wanted that could speak to the evidence in this area.
And just to jump in for a moment there is quite a bit of research that was returned that related to post-secondary education programs for students with ID. It's really just that they didn't look at employment. Mostly they looked at other factors which are extremely important. For example, a lot of them looked at the impact of post-secondary education on psychological well-being, or perspectives of parents or professors who participated in PSE programs. So a lot of really rich literature that just didn't relate specifically to what we were focused on.
That's a great point. Thank you for adding that.
I'd like to review some of the findings from the scoping review we did. So as Josh mentioned, we really went through a very stringent process in order to come up with those 12 specific studies. And I also want to really point out that overall, the findings really indicated generally positive support for the impact of PSE on employment. So we organized the findings into sort of 4 inquiries, and I'll go over each of them, but on the first slide, the first one relates to those employment-specific components that students received while they were enrolled. And we did notice, similar to what was reported in previous literature, even though we extended out another decade and really looked at, again, more particularly employment, that there was a lot of inconsistencies in terms of reporting the depth of details related to the types of experiences that students were getting while they were in the program focused on employment. In general, there was a lot higher reporting of employment experiences in terms of those applied work, so the paid work or the internships or the job shadowing experiences. Overwhelmingly, most programs had some component like that they did include when they published their studies. And again, a lot more reporting of those experiences than the actual coursework. So what I was speaking of earlier when I said, those career exploration coursework or potentially classes related to an area of major of interest. And it's not to say that students didn't necessarily participate in these experiences, it's just that they weren't being reported consistently within the literature, which made it very difficult for us to be able to really link a lot of those particular components with any sort of later employment outcomes. So the next finding is related to employment outcomes in particular. So whether or not a student did achieve a position in the community in competitive integrated employment. So really what we look for there is competitive means that it's a job within the community, that they would get comparative pay for their work, and would also be among individuals without disabilities. So that's really the outcome that we're looking for here, is competitive integrated employment. And as I mentioned, overall, the rates were pretty high. There was a range across those 12 studies from 50.8% to 91%, depending upon the studies. And there were different types of studies there that offered some information in terms of comparisons. So a study by Cranston Gringus et al. In 2015, who reported that lower range 50.8%. While that was again at the lower range, 50.8% of those students that exited that PSE program became employed, compared to only 17% of that same sample of students who achieved employment prior to participation in the program. So certainly there was a very large increase in terms of the employment outcome within that same sample from pre to post participation in the PSE program. And then there was also a comparison study by Moore and Schilling in 2014, where 73% of those students completing an integrated program and 91% who participated in a specialized or more separate program were in competitive employment upon completing the program. And these rates are really high when you look at, in that same study, the comparison sample, only 37.2% in the match sample comparison group achieved competitive integrated employment. And so in general, longitudinal data was lacking, but there was a post-graduation survey that was conducted that 272 students completing a TIPSID between 2015 and 2018, which is very recently, at 64% in paid employment at a 1-year follow-up. So that means that a year after they graduated, they were in competitive employment. And then lastly, I just want to mention that we talk a lot about employment outcomes in terms of whether or not a student gets a job. But there's also quality of job that is a really important factor. So those sort of extension variables of job. So how many hours is a student working? You know, what are they being paid for that work? Are they in an industry that matches their job interests? And those are really important pieces that offer kind of that, again, quality of job that weren't necessarily reported in the studies that we found. So it primarily focused on just whether or not the students were employed and sort of left a lot of the information there. So I think that's an important note that will kind of lead into some of the future directions that Josh will address later on in this presentation.
You kind of touched on it, Lauren, but even that 50%, even though it seems a little low on right there, I mean, thinking back to that original figure that we mentioned at the beginning of only 18% overall as a national population of folks engaged in competitive integrated employment. It's still a huge jump. So definitely some positive results.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the third area we looked at was those processes and supports for transition to employment after the post-secondary education program. Some articles in our sample did briefly mention planning procedures. So they talked a little bit about service collaboration or maybe person-centered planning, and oftentimes the inclusion of like a vocational rehabilitation agent would be involved in that, but very few elaborated a lot on what specific types of processes they included, for how many students it was included, or how those processes contributed to eventual employment outcomes. One of the reports by Think College, and Think College is the National Coordinating Center for TIPSID, so they track information on these programs. They did a 4-year annual report in 2019, and they reported that 34% in TIPSIDs received employment services from vocational rehabilitation while they were enrolled in the program. So 34% was what they reported. And it's certainly possible that many programs, again, are including different types of ways to network with adult service agencies or install those supports that a student might need in terms of applying for a job upon exit, or on the job training, or maybe just maintenance supports. But we didn't find that specific details were provided so that other programs could necessarily replicate what was found as effective, or allow for any sort of analysis to kind of decide what might be effective. So again, just to make the point, it's not necessarily that these processes aren't being done, because it's very possible that they are. It's just that in the reporting, we weren't able to find that, which didn't allow for analysis for this particular scoping review.
Yeah, that's definitely, and I'll talk about this in a couple slides with our implications for research, but definitely such an area of need in the future so that we can better understand sort of what parts of these programs are really effective.
Lastly, we looked at research methodology, which we've spoken about quite a bit throughout this presentation. So of the 12 studies, nearly all of them use non-experimental design. So instead, they mainly reported descriptive statistics associated with employment program or employment outcomes. So 3 used a quasi-experimental design, which included matched samples, and 1 reported a pre to post employment data. So in general, and these studies used kind of a lower rigor of methodology rather than more stringent, like a randomized control design. So to date, we don't actually have any randomized control designs related to post-secondary education programs and employment, which could really help us understand both the extent of the efficacy of these PSC programs, and also really speak to a wider audience of why they're necessary.
So shifting over to our implications and future directions for research policy and practice, a lot of these areas, Lauren did such a great job of summarizing kind of what we learned and what we found in our review. Some of these should be pretty intuitive, but we do want to talk about sort of, okay, what are the next steps for what we've learned from this review? And so we'll start with thinking about, what are the implications of what we learned from this review in terms of practice? And the first one, we've talked about it in a lot of different ways, but really getting down to operationally defining what are those key components of programs, and being very clear when reporting exactly what it means, so that we can have more consistent reporting about level of inclusiveness, about the credentialing process that's provided to students who participate in these PSC programs, about the components of the employment experiences and coursework that are part of the program, but also those outcome measures as well, so that we can better understand, what's working across the board, and where do we maybe need to expand certain practices that work in some settings, and make for a better comparison between the two. But first, we have to have that consistency in reporting. So one of the keys that we'd really like to highlight is just a better operational definition of some of those characteristics. And then that kind of leads us to the second point, is until we have a better understanding from the research literature about exactly what parts of those components work, the recommendation really is going to be to rely on those practices that we already know from the research literature work in other areas. So we may not have research literature that points specifically to these practices in a post-secondary education setting, but we do know that paid community work experience for individuals with intellectual disability is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictors of better outcomes in the area of employment afterwards. So we really have even though it's not specific to this setting, we have a good reason to be confident that by providing those experiences to students who participate in PSC programs, we're going to set them up for success afterwards. And then kind of connected to these ideas, we need a reporting process not only for kind of what happens within the PSC program, but also that really critical connection that PSC programs make to bridge the gap between students and families, and then engagement in employment service providers. So those, that provide the job coaching, job development services after the exit, that are going to continue to support and make sure that students are set up to continue on their career and sustain that after they leave those programs. So these are really critical just for better understanding the reporting process and knowing how that happens and how those connections and linkages are made. Thinking about our implications for research, again, as Lauren touched on many of these points with our findings, we have a good understanding of some really positive trends and correlations between what's happening in these PSC programs and some better outcomes. We're seeing a big jump from that 18% mark of individuals with ID participating in competitive employment up to a 50 to 90% range. So really positive gains. But what we need now is more rigorous methodology that's going to be able to show more of a causal link between these. That's going to take it beyond, a correlational relationship and be able to make the case that really there's a causal relationship that participating in this PSC program, we have a lot of confidence and evidence that that's going to lead to these better outcomes. And alongside that, we also need longitudinal studies that will look at what happens to these individuals after they leave over time. Is there a sustained effect of maintaining this employment? Are folks keeping jobs that they're able to secure as part of this because of the preparation and because of the experiences that they have in these PSC programs? Or, is there another relationship going on? Are there gaps maybe in terms of experiences or things that need to be part of these programs that maybe have been overlooked that we need to better understand through this, through future research. And alongside that, we need to look beyond just getting a job or not having a job as this dichotomous or two-level variable, and really look at what's the quality of employment. We haven't really touched on it too much, but one of the other things we know for this population of folks with intellectual disability is that a limited number of hours and jobs that wages don't increase commensurate to what we'd expect from typical career progression. And so we want to see jobs where folks are getting better wages and having more hours to be able to further themselves in their career. So better understanding how PSC programs may lead to some of these higher quality jobs or careers really are important. And then also more research focusing on demographics. So, it's important to understand not only how these PSC programs affect individuals with intellectual disabilities as a whole, but they may have differential effects on some groups that we need to better understand. One of the things that we've seen from the descriptive data around post-secondary education programs is that they tend to cater more towards certain groups of individuals that come from certain demographic backgrounds that have more means. And so better understanding how we can, PSC programs can create more equitable access and also serve groups from more diverse backgrounds is definitely needed moving forward. And finally, for policy, a lot of what we need right now that's clear from a review of the research is just more research. And so part of that is there's a great need for policymakers to provide additional funding for research in this area so that we can better understand some of the items that we've outlined in this presentation. And alongside that, better legislation, since post-secondary education programs really sit at this transition between students as they're part of the K-12 educational settings and these educational agencies and their progression into careers and those service providers that provide support through these experiences within workplaces in the community. There's a need for coordination for these PSC programs to link with both those K-12 partners, but also those adult agency partners. And so there's a great need for policy that better aligns the legislation that impacts not only the PSC programs themselves, that Higher Education Opportunity Act, but as legislation like IDEA and WIOA are reauthorized and guidance is given to states and localities, better alignment between how these pieces of legislation fit together to create a comprehensive support package for individuals with intellectual disabilities. So some need for attention moving forward in the policy world as well. So in wrapping up, we just wanted to summarize some of what this review found and what it contributes to the knowledge base. And so overall, our scoping review found support, for the efficacy of these post-secondary education programs and promoting those competitive employment outcomes that we want to see for students with ID. Despite a lack of sort of the highest level of rigor, overall, the evidence was positive and did show support. We found that many of the programs described included a really rich vocational training that was included in those applied settings. We found that the outcome data suggested that the rates of employment that participants enjoyed were higher than those participants had prior to entering the PSC program, and also when compared to groups that didn't participate in the PSC program, they were higher than those as well. So definitely saw some indication that there's perhaps an effect that the PSC program themselves is the mechanism for these individuals by which they increase their rates of employment. But we do need more research in this area, and specifically in which of those components of the program are specifically associated with and related to these better outcomes. So what is it really that needs to be under the hood for these things to be effective? We need to do a bit more investigation in that area. So we really appreciate your taking the time to join us for this webinar. And this is the first of multiple in this series, and we'll be back soon to talk about the effects of competitive integrated employment on some other outcomes for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But we thank you for joining us.
And these are the references that accompany this slide, and then also our statement of acknowledgement to our funder.